All right, so we have a fairly complex object literal here. It has some simple properties, but then it also has some more complex properties, like a property that contains another object literal, as well as a property that contains an array of other object literals. Now, how do we get at some of that information? Well, let's do this. Let's see what we get printed out here. Make sure that nothing else is really going to stand in our way. Okay. And let's open that up. Great. So we were able to call the notification method of the faction object literal, which is merely a property of the planet object literal, by just using this member accessor notation. So we're able to chain these calls together. All right. Let's do one more thing here. What about if we wanted to get one of these cities? We would simply do this. All right, so notice the use of our index to access one element of the array which is a property of the planet object literal, in order to access one of its properties called name. And we were able to get it. Great. All right, and also then how would we set the values or change the values? Well, we can do this. So we have a before and after scenario, and we're going to rename the planet by merely accessing the name property and using the assignment operator to a new value. Let's go ahead and make sure we save everything, and let's go. So this is the before, and this is the after we've renamed it. Again, we would just use it like any other variable that we might be using. Let's go ahead and comment all that out. All right, so another interesting thing is that you can pass objects around by a reference to that object. So we can do something like this, var z equals planet. Now, z is a reference to our object literal. Therefore, we can do something like this, document dot write z dot name. And we get the name of our planet. All right, now let's suppose that we want to add a property or method that we're using our planet, and we need to add an additional piece of information or another implementation of a method to this planet. Is this definition sealed? Can we add more information about a planet later on after it's originally been implemented? The answer is yes, we can. Now, we want to be careful about that, because if we were to attempt to access, for example, the name, assuming that it didn't already have a name property, and we blow away the existing name, well, that would probably be some poor programming practices on our part. So what we need to do is use our type of operator again and see if, for example, let's say we want to create another property called defense. Is defense undefined? And in this case, notice that I've used the 2 equal operator. I think the 3 equal operator will work too. Let's go ahead and use that just to see. If not, then we can come back to it, because I think it returns the string undefined, so I think we're good. But here we want to now just start using a new variable called defense, or a new member called defense. We're going to set it to ion cannon. And then later on we will do a document.write planet.defense. Let's see if this works. And it does. Great. So here again, at any point in time, you can add additional members to object literals that have already been defined earlier in your code by merely just start referencing them. Of course, you want to be a little careful about referencing those that may have already been defined either here or in the code prior to the code that is running. So you want to do a check first. Has this already been defined? Oh, it hasn't? Then let's go ahead and define it. Otherwise, we might take some other step of logic, okay? And that's up to you to decide as the programmer. All right, another thing you can do is you can iterate through all of the members. I think we've already shown that a little bit earlier with the use of our utility function, but I'm going to rewrite it in a slightly more interesting way. All right, so here we're just going to type in the name of the member and then so let's see how this will differ than the utility that we created a little bit earlier. All right, so in this case, you can see some something a bit different than we saw previously. We get the actual name of the property or of if we were to have any methods defined, which we don't at the topmost level. But then also notice that when we do go to print out the value of this particular member, it's just of type object. And in this case, in the cities, it has 3 different objects all in an array. So that's an interesting side effect there. All right, just really academic more than anything else, I think, at this point. All right, but let me just kind of conclude that particular thought process by saying that you can use object literals, or you will use object literals often whenever you're working with JavaScript libraries. For example, one of my favorite JavaScript libraries is called the jQuery tools, and they produce a media player called Flow Player. And if you take a look inside of Flow Player, notice how you set some of the values. So let me go down here. This is how you reference or initialize the Flow Player object, by passing in an object literal. And so by understanding the syntax, where okay, we're going to set the clip to another object literal, an embedded object literal inside of that, where we're setting a property called autoplay to false, auto buffering to true, base URL to this, and so on. That is setting up the Flow Player to configure it so that it displays and it operates inside of the browser the way that you, the developer, want to use it. So the programmer who created Flow Player made all of these properties available. You pass in an object literal defining how you want to set up the Flow Player, and then it uses your settings and functions accordingly. Okay, so that's pretty neat, and you'll see that again very often whenever you're working with JavaScript or jQuery plugins. All right, let's move on to another idea here, and that is using the new operator. It's confusing whenever you see that JavaScript has a new operator, but it doesn't have the notion of classes. Typically, you would use the new operator to create a new instance of a given class in the computer's memory, and then you would initialize it afterwards. However, in JavaScript, the new operator creates an instance of a user-defined object type, or of one of the built-in objects that has a constructor function. So this is how it's used in JavaScript. Notice that we're starting off with a car, and we're going to allow the car to have a make, a model, and a year. All right, and then inside of this function, we'll say we want our car to have a make property, and so we'll assign it to the temporary variable of make that has been passed in to the constructor. And I just happen to name these exactly the same. I could say my make or temp make, temp model, temp year. So hopefully that doesn't throw you. But we'll show you how this manifests itself here in a second. Now I can create a new instance, I guess you would say, of the car called my car using the new keyword. Sorry. Let's fix that. Okay, there we go. Then we can reference those properties as you might expect. All right, so let's go ahead and save this. Great. And so I think the moral of the story there is that what you're doing is defining a constructor. And inside of that, you're defining the properties of an object by the same name as the constructor. When you use the new keyword, you're saying, I'm going to pass in arguments to the constructor so that we can create a new car object with its properties, make, model, and year set, so that we can then reference it later on. It's a slightly different way of thinking about objects. This isn't a class per se, it's a constructor. That's why it has the function keyword in front of it. Okay? All right, so much to take in, but I think the real important part of this is the construction and the use of object literals within JavaScript. JavaScript is a classless language. Okay? It allows you to define, however, properties and methods and give them both the property and the value all in one context. You can then later on add or change the values like we did here. And you can also create constructors which set the properties at the time of construction when using the new keyword. All right? So hopefully none of that blew you away. I wouldn't worry about that last part. It's a little bit more advanced. We're not going to use that very often, and you don't see it all that often in code either, at least the code that I'm familiar with. So, okay, very good. We're going to continue to build on this in the next lesson. We'll see you there. Thank you. Hi, I'm Bob Tabor with LearnVisualStudio.net. In this lesson, we're going to finally talk about the document object model, or rather, as it's known, the DOM. At a high level, the DOM is simply a hierarchical collection of software objects, each object representing a single HTML element or a single literal string on the web page. Now, one of the main reasons that the DOM exists is so that developers can programmatically modify the behavior of the web page using JavaScript. So let's suppose that you request an HTML web page from a website. The server returns the HTML page and your browser downloads the raw HTML into memory. But how does it take that raw HTML and then render it to screen and allow you to modify the behavior of the HTML using JavaScript? So I want to describe a series of steps, but in doing so, I realize that I'm oversimplifying what really goes on because honestly, I'm not privy to how these features are really implemented inside of web browsers. I'm going to be describing each step as kind of a linear process, but I am sure that modern web browsers will perform these steps in parallel, and that it's a lot more complicated than I'm making it out to sound, okay? But my bare bones explanation here should serve as the general series of steps required for a web browser to translate HTML into what you ultimately view on screen and what you ultimately are working with as a JavaScript developer in the DOM. Okay? So the first step after the browser receives the raw HTML is to parse through it. The parser engine is that part of the browser that translates the HTML into a series of recognizable tokens. So, for example, it'll see some text and it'll say, ooh, that's an HTML element. It'll see some more text and it'll say, ooh, that looks like a literal string. It'll see some more text, oh, that's an HTML element. And it refers to this image, this video, this Flash movie, this external JavaScript file, this external cascading style sheet file. And so it may have to stop right there and start downloading some things, right? Perhaps because a number of different reasons. For example, with the cascading style sheets, it needs some of that information as it's constructing its DOM so that it can present things correctly when it gets to the part when it's actually rendering it to screen. So the parser's main job is to turn those recognizable tokens into a tree of related objects. The rendering engine will then use that tree of related objects to determine where it will position elements on screen. So you as a developer will then be able to use JavaScript to interact with this tree of related objects through a number of properties and methods that each object inherits at the point it was instantiated. All right. So most of this lesson will focus on exactly that, learning about the properties and the methods exposed by the DOM that you can reference inside of your JavaScript. So let me illustrate that with a little web page that you see on screen. So here we have a simple document with a header and a couple of paragraphs. I just want to call your attention to the header 1 that has some text in it, and then also to the paragraph that has an ID of second. It also contains a child element of strong, and then within it, it has some literal text second paragraph. So first of all, in this example, when the parser loads the HTML file and it locates that first H1 element, it'll create an object that represents that H1 element in its own memory. The browser then attaches that new H1 element as a child to its parent object, which in this case is the body element itself. And then it keeps doing this until the browser has a complete representation of the page in memory in a tree-like structure. And that tree-like structure of related objects in the browser's memory is the document object model, the DOM. So again, I'm going to oversimplify this greatly and I'm going to leave some things out, but it's roughly turned into a hierarchy of objects that looks something like this, where you have some top-level objects, the window, the document, and then you see the H1 in a series of paragraphs below it. Notice that paragraph with an ID of second, it has a child called strong, and it has a child literal text with the words hello world inside of it, and I've left the rest of those sorts of things out of this diagram. But you'll notice first of all that the DOM has these top level objects like the window and the document. These are important. They expose a number of functions to access any given element in the DOM, so you can do things like get a reference to a given DOM element. We'll do that in just a minute. The window is important because it allows you to respond to an important event in the web page's lifecycle, and we'll talk about that in just a minute too. Okay, so at this point I have another example to take a look at. It's actually similar to the one we saw on screen, but it actually is working. You can see here is what it looks like in Internet Explorer. And then if we take a look at the c9js_13.html file in Notepad, you can see that inside of its body there's an H1 with the ID of title. Then it has a couple of divs. Here's a div and here's a div. And inside those divs it has 3 paragraphs. Notice that second paragraph still has a strong and some text in it. We'll probably get to that in a little bit. And then it also has an input type equals submit ID of click me. Remember that word click me. We'll be using that throughout the remainder of this video. And then it also has this hyperlink, and we'll use this, and it has an ID of my anchor. So we'll get to that a little bit later as well as we start programmatically touching some of these HTML elements. All right. So suppose that, first of all, we want to attach an event handler to the click event of this button, the submit button with an ID of click me. How would we go about doing that? Well, let's take a look at the script13.js. You should be able to locate it with the rest of the content that you were able to download for this video. And notice that it has, we have a function in it already called function run the example, and it's simply going to open up an alert box. We'll add some more code in this as time goes on. But the first thing I want to do is try to attach this function and have it fire off every time the input button is clicked. So how can we go about doing that? Well, what we can try the first time around is to get a reference programmatically to that input button, and then we'll attach this event to its on-click event property. So let's start here, click me button. So I've got a variable called click me button, and I'm going to use the document dot get element by ID. So it's that document object. Again, this gives us access, programmatic access to the rest of the DOM. And we'll use this get element by ID method to retrieve a single element in the DOM using its ID, in this case, click me. All right. Now that we have a reference to that input button, then I'm going to use click me button dot on click. So whenever the button is clicked, we're going to execute run the example, which is this code right here. All right. So let's try this. Go ahead and refresh my browser, but as you can see, absolutely nothing happens. And the reason nothing happens is because there is a timing issue, or rather there's an issue with the order in which the events are occurring on the web page. I'm going to have a lot more to say about this at the very end of this video, but in a nutshell, at the point when this code is executed, the DOM element called click me has not yet been created. So the code is ignored, and since this code is ignored, obviously this code is ignored, and we never get it to execute whenever you click the click me button on the web page. All right, so what we need to do is slow this down a little bit, wait for the click me button to be created as a DOM element, then we can execute this code. And then, because we executed that code and we attached the run the example to the onClick event, whenever we click the button, it'll actually happen. And so, one option that we have is to use a event called window.onload. And the window.onload event is raised once the entire web page has been loaded, not just once the DOM has been finished being constructed, but also once all images and videos and flash files and what have you that web page is referencing, after all of that has been successfully downloaded, there's nothing else to download, then the window.onload event will fire. All right, so we're going to see a little bit that why this is a problem. But at first glance, it's great because we can be 100% sure that the DOM will be available at that point. The downside is that it could take our web page a really long time to download huge image files, huge video files, huge flash, or whatever the case might be, files that are associated with that web page. And so we're going to be waiting a long time for that window.onload event to fire off. Meanwhile, the user could be clicking around our web page, but we haven't had a chance to attach our JavaScript to that web page yet. You see the dilemma? Again, let's table this, come back to it a little bit later in this video. For now, we don't have any images. I'm not really all that worried about it. This will work for the time being, all right? And what will work? Well, here's what I'm going to do. So go window.onload equals, and then I'll create an anonymous function, and that anonymous function will just contain these 2 lines of code in it. All right, so let's save this. Let's refresh that. And now when we click the click me button, we get running the example alert box to show up because our button was successfully attached to this function. All right, now I took 2 steps just to demonstrate what the document.get by element by ID does. Most of the time when you see this, it's going to look more like this. And then immediately you'll call the onClick and set that equal to run the example. All right, so that's a little bit more realistic. Let me refresh this, and it still works. Great. Okay, So just to be clear here, I'm attaching an anonymous function to the onload event of the window. So once the web page completely finishes, this function will fire off, which in turn will find the click me button and attach the run the example to the click event of that button. Great. So basically, once you have a programmatic reference to read values from elements in the DOM, to change values of elements in the DOM, to add new elements to the DOM, to attach JavaScript code like we did to elements that are fired by interacting with elements in the DOM, like clicking a button or a link or so on. But it all starts with getting a reference to an individual element in the DOM, or one or more elements in the DOM. And once you have a reference, you can change its content, you can change its style, its visibility, change its behavior, manipulate it in a number of different ways. So now that we understand how to get a reference to a given element in the DOM, let's look at some of the ways, just a few of the ways, that we can navigate through the DOM, change properties of a given DOM element, and so on. So at this point, what I want to do is I'm going to actually save this for later, because we're going to come back to this simple version. And what I'm going to do is create a new version of it that we'll use for the time being. Okay? And what we'll start with is, let's just get a reference to one of the elements inside of our HTML page. So var my element equals document.get element by ID, and let's grab that second paragraph, the element with the paragraph element with the ID of second. Remember that one? We kind of picked on it a couple of times here. And the first thing we can do is just find out what kind of a HTML element it is. So var my node name equals my element dot node name, and then let's just do alert my node name. And I'm taking some extra steps here. I could have compacted this greatly, but I want to make everything clear as to what we're doing and why we're doing it. So at this point, we can see that second paragraph is of type P. It's a paragraph element, in other words. Okay, great. Now let's do this. Let's make sure that my element is not null. It's not empty. And if it's not empty, then let's do a different alert. This time, let's go my element and grab its inner HTML. And I have a caution about this in just a moment here. Let's comment this one out. And let's refresh this. And so what we can do is grab the HTML that's inside of our paragraph. So that's why we're seeing HTML tags like strong surrounding the text itself, second paragraph. Okay? And the good folks at Microsoft wanted me to caution you about using inner HTML. So inner HTML has years of vendor support, browser support. The fact is that until the HTML5 specification came out, it was never a standard. It was never something that you can rely on all browsers supporting. So again, while almost every browser has supported inner HTML, you might want to use it with caution. This is another area where jQuery will smooth over the browser differences and give us properties that we can use across virtually every popular browser. So probably in the real world going forward, I would never use inner HTML. I'd probably rely on jQuery for some of these sorts of things to retrieve certain values like the text that's inside of a given element and so on. All right, so just use inner HTML with caution, but hey, since we're on the topic, let's go ahead and use inner HTML in another capacity. Here, I'm just going to start over again from scratch and do inner HTML equals see how I set the text here. And so what we're going to do, here we grabbed the value of inner HTML and sent it to screen. But now, let's comment all this out. Let's use it to set content on screen. And you're going to need to watch closely what happens here. So let's refresh this. Now notice it says second paragraph, but I'm going to click the button and it changes to see how I set the text here. So that's what I meant by behavior and by reacting to some DOM events and then using that to trigger the change of the appearance